36 years ago, a young woman in Kentucky vanished on her way home, disappearing into the night without leaving a single trace, plunging her family into despair for decades. Authorities suspected a man living nearby was involved, but with no body, no witnesses, and too few clues to pursue, the investigation quickly stalled. Yet through all those years, Claire's family never gave up hope, clinging to the belief that the truth was out there somewhere, just waiting to be found. And then, one day, when investigators revisited what seemed like meaningless evidence, they spotted a tiny detail everyone had overlooked, a detail powerful enough to upend the entire case and shock Kentucky. Before we dive into this shocking journey, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe to keep following along. One summer night in Kentucky, the air was thick with humidity that clung to the skin, a light breeze sweeping across the sprawling fields along Old Frankfort Pike, carrying the scent of fresh grass and warm earth. The headlights of the few passing vehicles glided slowly over the dark road, leaving faint trails of light that were quickly swallowed by the darkness. The chirping of crickets blended with the distant calls of coyotes, creating a monotonous yet unsettling symphony, like something waiting to happen. In that quiet scene, Claire Whitmore, 23 years old, left work and stepped into the night. She opened her car door, slid into the driver's seat, turned on the headlights, and drove her light-colored car toward the familiar road she'd taken hundreds of times. A peaceful journey that no one could have imagined would be the last time they saw her. The rare passers-by, when questioned years later, only vaguely remembered a car passing them, its red taillights fading into the pitch-black sky. No one saw anything unusual. No one stopped. No one knew that as soon as that car disappeared from sight, the silence of the field seemed to thicken, as if the night had swallowed something important. The night wore on. In the small house where Claire lived, the wall clock ticked steadily and heavily. She had said she'd be home soon. But then 1 hour passed, then 2, then 3. No sound of a car pulling into the driveway, no jingle of keys at the door, no familiar footsteps on the wooden porch. The family called her phone. No answer. They tried again. The phone just rang on, cold and endless, as if echoing from somewhere far away. They tried to reassure themselves, reminding each other that she might have been held up somewhere, that maybe her car broke down, that maybe she stopped to visit a friend. But those reassurances quickly wore thin as time dragged on, and the silence in the house grew thick like fog condensing around the windows. When the eastern sky began to change color, fading into the gray light of dawn, the worry in Claire's family exceeded what they could bear. They looked at each other, no one needing to say aloud what they were all fearing. A trembling hand picked up the phone. The call to the police was made. Less than an hour after the family reported her missing, 2 Lexington Police Department patrol cars pulled up in front of the Whitmore home. Their headlights shone brightly on the porch, revealing the tense faces of the relatives who had been awake all night. Inside, the small living room was filled with an atmosphere of anxiety, unanswered questions, the landline phone sitting in the middle of the table, as if waiting for one more ring, though no one expected it. The officers began gathering information urgently, according to procedure. They asked the family about Claire's daily habits, the route she usually took after her shift, and whether she had mentioned changing her route or stopping anywhere that evening. Every answer pointed in the same direction. Claire always took Old Frankfort Pike home, without exception. One officer called the Lexington Clinic to confirm her departure time. The night security guard confirmed 9:10 p.m. Nothing unusual, no one following her, no strangers in the parking lot. Another call to Claire's coworkers yielded the same result. A normal shift, ending normally, no signs that anything was about to happen. Once the basic information was recorded, the scene commander divided the team into 2 groups. One group immediately headed out, driving straight to Old Frankfort Pike to scan the road Claire should have taken. The other stayed at the house to search Claire's room, checking if any items were missing, if she had left a note, or if there was any sign she had unusual plans. But Claire's room was almost exactly as it had been every other night. Clothes folded neatly, books stacked tidily, her spare purse still hanging on the chair. No open suitcase, no hastily written message, nothing suggesting she intended to leave for a long time or meet someone. While the team at the house was taking notes, The radio in the patrol car outside suddenly crackled. Another unit scanning western Fayette County reported they had just received information from a long-haul trucker who had passed through Old Frankfort Pike. He said he saw a small light-colored car parked close to the shoulder in the darkest stretch of the road, lights off, and the car parked at a slight angle, as if it had been stopped suddenly. He didn't stop because he figured it was just a breakdown, but the feeling that something wasn't right made him mention it to police when he heard about a missing woman from that same night. As soon as that information came in, the officers' expressions in the house changed. The location the trucker described matched exactly the route Claire had to take. Discovering an unidentified car sitting silently during the time Claire vanished couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. The commander immediately ordered all search units to redirect. 2 patrol cars flashed their lights, but kept sirens off, speeding away from the Whitmore home, so fast the dust hadn't even settled. The family stood at the front door, watching the red and blue lights flicker before disappearing toward the rural road. In the faint light of the emerging dawn, their faces were both tense and hopeful. If that car was Claire's, at least they would know how far she had gotten. But at the same time, that very possibility terrified them, because if the car had been abandoned, Claire could now be somewhere in the vast Kentucky darkness, her condition unknown. Silence returned to the house the police had just left, but this time it was no longer the silence of waiting. It was the silence of a family who had just realized something very serious had happened, and from the moment police redirected to that strange car, the case had gone far beyond someone simply coming home late. It had become a time-sensitive search, and the Kentucky night, already uncertain, now seemed to contract around a mystery gradually taking shape. The 2 patrol cars raced at full speed toward the stretch of road the trucker had described. Old Frankfort Pike in that section was almost completely shrouded in darkness, with only isolated patches of light from the headlights illuminating the rough asphalt. As the officers slowed down, they all leaned forward, peering through the windshield for signs of the reported car. And then, not far ahead, the shape of a light-colored sedan appeared like a silent shadow parked at the edge of the road. Claire's car. One officer got out first, hand on his flashlight, approaching slowly by the book. The bright beam swept over the body of the car, from hood to roof to windows, no one inside. Lights completely off, engine cold, as if it hadn't run for hours. The car was parked at a slight angle, nose dipping toward the low grass ditch below the road, like a vehicle that had been stopped abruptly or forced to the shoulder. They checked all the doors. All 4 were locked. No signs of prying or forcing. This ruled out violent break-in, but raised a bigger question. If Claire had locked the doors herself, why would she leave the car in the middle of the night on a remote stretch like this? The investigators lined up along the side of the car, shining flashlights into the cabin. The driver's seat was adjusted for Claire's height, the passenger seat undisturbed. No scattered belongings, no broken glass, no phone left on the seat, though cell phones weren't common then. Police checked out of habit, car radio off, steering wheel lock intact, no signs of tampering. The most notable thing wasn't what they saw, but what they didn't. Any sign of Claire. No purse, no note, no dropped items, no clear footprints leading from the car into the woods. No sounds except the wind rustling through the trees and insects chirping in the night. A complete absence, no clues, no direction, as if the 23-year-old woman had dissolved into thin air right where she stopped. The officers quickly expanded the search. One shone his light along the road's edge, another swept the area behind the car where the grass was taller. As the flashlight beam passed over the damp ground, one officer froze. Near the grass edge, behind the rear of the car, there was a faint imprint in the gravelly soil, too faint to determine size or shoe type, but clear enough to recognize it as a shoe print, not matching the pattern of any officer present. It was about 1 step away from the rear of the car. The officers exchanged brief glances. No one jumped to conclusions, but they all understood the significance of that discovery. If the print wasn't Claire's, and it likely wasn't, then at least one person had stood behind this car at some point that night. A person whose departure time, direction, or current whereabouts were unknown. One officer measured the distance between the print and the rear wheel, trying to determine the stance of whoever made it. It seemed the person was standing at a slight angle, facing the shoulder, perhaps looking around, or doing something related to the trunk. But since the print was so faint, any analysis remained speculative. Another detail caught their attention. The area around the car had very little dust or soft surface to retain footprints, yet the only print was precisely behind the rear of the car. It wasn't near where a driver would normally step out, not close to the driver's or passenger's door, but in a very unnatural position for anyone, simply pulling over. This made it less likely that Claire had stepped out and walked around the car herself. And if she hadn't exited through the driver's door, the passenger door was locked, and there were no signs of fleeing. The question grew larger: what happened before this car was abandoned here? One officer checked the other side of the road, where the grass was shorter and the ground softer, hoping for similar traces, but nothing. The grass wasn't bent, no patches of soil disturbed, no indication anyone had crossed into the sparse woods. Police radioed that the car had been found. Orders came down: expand the search perimeter in a fan pattern from the vehicle's location, checking both sides of the road for several hundred yards. Another team was called in with high-powered floodlights to illuminate the entire area, aiding the search in the darkness. The atmosphere around the car grew tense. Though no one said it aloud, the officers all felt a chill spreading from a frightening realization: Claire hadn't left the car in a normal way, and the person who left the footprint behind the car was very likely the last one to see her. In many other cases, police often find small clues: a wallet, a scrap of fabric, a dropped key. But here everything was unusually clean, too clean for a random disappearance, too clean for a voluntary abandonment. A car sitting still, locked, lights off, intact. An owner vanished without a trace. A faint footprint, in exactly the place no one expected. As the floodlights shone strongly into the cabin once more, one officer said quietly, almost to himself rather than his colleagues, "Something's not right here, really not right." And from that moment, Claire Whitmore's disappearance was no longer a simple missing person search, but a mystery unfolding layer by layer in the Kentucky darkness. Additional search teams quickly arrived at Old Frankfort Pike. A police truck parked nearby turned on high-powered floodlights, casting cold light over the asphalt road and the low bushes along the edge. In the fading darkness, the area around Claire's car was cordoned off with yellow tape, forming a radius that officers were expanding meter by meter. They moved slowly, carefully examining every bent blade of grass, every tire mark, every patch of ground that might have been overlooked at first glance. One officer knelt beside the right front tire of the sedan. Under the strong light, he noticed the dirt and gravel stuck to the tire was a different color from the surrounding soil. Along Old Frankfort Pike, the roadside dirt was a distinctive brown mixed with small rocks, but the residue on Claire's tire was pale gray with yellow tones, as if picked up from somewhere else and brought here. At the time, they simply noted it in the report: soil not matching the scene. No one could know yet that this seemingly minor and harmless detail would become one of the most important pieces later on, but on that morning, it was just something to flag. While the outdoor team scoured every meter of ground, two other officers focused entirely on the car's interior. They turned on flashlights, examining every corner, every seat seam, every crevice in the dashboard. No signs Claire had left intentionally: no purse, no jacket, no items left behind. People who leave normally rarely abandon a car completely empty, doors locked tight, without taking any personal belongings. The cabin also showed no signs of a struggle or being dragged from the seat: no scratches, no torn seatbelt, no dirt or strange marks on the driver's seat. Everything was strangely tidy, as if the car had been abandoned deliberately, or by someone who wasn't its owner. One officer checked the dashboard gauges. The gas needle was near half full. This reinforced that Claire hadn't stopped due to a mechanical issue or running out of fuel. He leaned close to the steering wheel, inspecting the ignition and surrounding area. No signs of prying or forced tools, meaning the car had been turned off properly with the key. That raised an even bigger question: if Claire turned off the engine and locked the doors, why would she leave the car in the dark on a remote road without telling her family or anyone? And more importantly, How did she leave when the driver's door was locked from the outside? Meanwhile, another officer was examining the car's parking position. He stepped back, arms crossed, observing the whole scene like a big picture. The car was angled off the straight path home. On her normal route, Claire would have continued about 3 more miles, then turned right onto the branch leading to her house. But in this spot, the car was parked as if forced to the shoulder. The front tire marks showed a slight swerve to the right, not like normal parking, but like a driver forced to stop suddenly, or avoid something ahead. This made the she pulled over, due to a problem theory less likely. If the car broke down, Claire would tend to find a lit area, near homes, or where help was easier. But this stretch was the emptiest, darkest, least chosen for stopping. A young officer whispered, "No one would pull over here without a really strong reason." The officers continued expanding the search across the road. The grass here was short, and the ground soft, where footprints would show easily if present. But nothing. The grass stood straight, no trampled or bent signs. A wild rabbit darted across, but no indication anyone had walked through that night. This only heightened the sense that if Claire left the car, she didn't walk into the woods or fields. They checked the left shoulder, where a gentle slope led to softer ground. Again nothing, no skid marks, no fall traces, no drag signs, everything as if wiped clean by the night before the sun rose. One officer returned to the rear of the car, where they found the faint shoe print. He used a ruler and flashlight to examine it again, too faint for size or style, but the overall shape showed it wasn't Claire's. Moreover, its position near the rear, rather than the driver's door, made it increasingly clear this was likely the mark of someone involved in foul play. No one on the team said it definitively, but they all silently acknowledged that the shoe print was the first clue revealing a second person. The commander ordered the entire car position documented with photos and diagrams, then directed expanding the search in 2 directions, one along the route Claire should have continued, one back the way she came. If Claire was forced from the car, or taken in another vehicle, the perpetrator's movement was likely within a short distance of the car, before turning onto a main road or side path. As the sun rose higher, casting pale golden light over the scene, the officers kept searching. But the more they looked, the more the car felt like an empty shell, silent, clean, and holding no answers. An object standing in the road, containing a void no one could explain, and every time they looked at that car, a shared feeling grew. Claire didn't leave here alone. And this abandoned car was just the first piece leading into a deeper web of mystery, somewhere in the darkness of Kentucky. As the sun hadn't fully risen yet, the darkness still blanketing a thin layer of mist over the fields and the surface of Old Frankfort Pike, the reinforced search team arrived with 2 K9 police dogs. They were trained to track human scent, and in disappearances this early on, time was a critical factor. If Claire was somewhere nearby, the chances of the K9 picking up her direction of movement were very high. A handkerchief belonging to Claire was brought by the family and handed to the K9 handler. The dog sniffed it carefully, ears perked up, paws straining forward, as if ready to bolt immediately. The handler gave the signal, and the search team began moving in the direction it led. At first, the scent trail ran along the shoulder, parallel to the main road, as if Claire had stood or moved around the car before vanishing. But just a few minutes later, the dog suddenly changed direction, pulling hard on the leash toward a nearby narrow side road, a thin dirt path leading into a wild area where tall grass grew and early morning dew clung in drops to the bushes. The officers shone their flashlights down the path. This side road wasn't paved, just a compacted dirt trail occasionally used by pickup trucks and tractors. Old tire tracks overlapped each other, not clear enough to determine timing. But the K9 was clearly reacting to something it pulled, sniffed deeply, then charged down the trail as if the human scent led inside. The search team followed closely behind, carefully avoiding stepping on any potential traces. They moved slowly, observing as they went. Was the grass flattened? Were there skid marks or dropped items? Were there any scraps of fabric or Claire's personal belongings? But the trail looked like it hadn't been used in days. Grass bent lightly from the wind, no fresh footprints, dry soil, no obvious disturbance. The dog pulled the team about 200 yards before suddenly stopping, sniffing around a low bush. It circled back and forth, sniffed again, then stood still. The handler signaled for it to continue searching, but its body language changed, no longer straining forward, but starting to veer side to side, confused as if the scent had been cut off. In missing persons cases, this was a bad sign. When a scent disappears abruptly, it often means the person didn't continue walking. They may have been loaded into another vehicle, a truck, a pickup, or any type that left the trail via a separate route the K9 couldn't follow. One officer noted, "Scent stops abruptly, no continuing direction." Another marked the spot with neon stakes and crime scene tape. Questions started arising. How did Claire get in here? Voluntarily or by force? And most importantly, who took her further? As the search team prepared to expand in a circle around the scent cutoff point, the radio crackled again from the patrol car parked near the main road. An officer on duty spoke in a lowered voice that made the group stop and listen. A resident, living about 2 miles from the car's location, had just called in. He reported that around the time last night, though he wasn't sure of the exact hour since he was half asleep, he heard a strange sound echoing from the direction of the main road. A woman's scream, short, sharp, as if choked off midway. Then nothing. No groans, no running sounds, no engine revving. Just one single sound cut off, sinking into the darkness. At first, he didn't think much of it because sounds echoing at night can sometimes be distorted by distance and trees. But when the news of the disappearance aired on the radio this morning, he called right away to report it. The officers exchanged quick words. That information, combined with the car found in an unusual position, and the K9 scent trail cutting off abruptly, started making the picture clearer, a picture no one wanted. The scream could have been Claire's, or even someone else's, but the timing matched remarkably. It happened right when Claire's car was believed to still be on the road, and in the exact stretch where the trucker had seen the car parked at an angle. One officer suggested returning to the area near the main road where the scream might have originated. If the scream came from there, it's very likely Claire hadn't gone deep into the side path, but was intercepted before she could get too far from the car. The K9 handler agreed. The scent cutting off abruptly could happen if Claire was grabbed near the turnoff, then taken away in a vehicle, leaving the area. The search team headed back to the main road. Morning light was gradually increasing, but mist still clung to the grass and ground, making everything look softer, flatter, easier to obscure traces. They rescanned every patch of ground near where the trucker had described, looking for signs they might have missed in the dark. Near the right side of the road, a few dozen yards from the car's position, one officer bent down to examine a slightly disturbed area of soil, not footprints, not clear tire marks, but the top layer of dirt lightly pushed to one side, as if something heavy had been placed down and lifted quickly. It couldn't be identified, but it was right in line with where the witness reported the sound. As the officers continued documenting the spot, the overall atmosphere grew more tense. They knew this disappearance now showed signs of a confrontation, an abduction, or an attempt at help that was silenced too quickly for anyone to hear. If that scream really was Claire's, then the moment it rang out was the last time that night her presence was recorded in any form, even if only as a sound. And even if no one saw her, last night, someone let out a single scream, then silence. And in the thick Kentucky darkness, silence is often not the end. It is the beginning of an unsolved vanishing. Once the report of the midnight scream was recorded, police expanded their collection of statements from residents along Old Frankfort Pike and drivers who passed through the area during the time Claire disappeared. They set up an information intake point right near where the car was found, where officers could speak directly with anyone willing to share what they'd seen that night. Not everyone remembered clearly. The darkness, the vagueness of late night, and the habit of rarely noticing what happens on the roadside made most accounts fragmented. But 3 witnesses provided notable details about vehicles seen near the area, and when pieced together, they formed a more unsettling picture than expected. The first witness was the long-haul trucker, who reported the angled car at dawn. When questioned further, he recalled that before seeing Claire's car, he had also seen a brown 80s-era pickup parked not far away, This pickup wasn't moving, but sitting on the shoulder, lights off, as if waiting. At first he thought the owner was just resting, but the timing between when he passed and when he came back with information about the sedan made him start feeling that detail wasn't so simple. An investigative team immediately recorded the description: brown pickup, long bed, old model, seemingly from the late 70s or early 80s. This type of truck was very common among mechanics, farmers or small haul drivers in Kentucky. That made narrowing down the owner harder, but it also increased the likelihood it belonged to a local living within a short radius. The second witness was a middle-aged woman, living on a small farm less than a mile from the scene. She said that on the night Claire disappeared, she saw headlights from a silver sedan stop for quite a while in a spot where people don't usually pull over. She noticed because the headlights shone into her horse barn wall, casting shadows on the ceiling for several minutes. When asked more, she said, "It stayed there so long I thought the driver was waiting for someone. It was stopped in the wrong place." The sedan then suddenly turned off its lights and drove away, but she couldn't identify the license plate or exact make. The appearance of the silver sedan caught police attention. Both the pickup and the sedan had appeared in the time frame Claire was in the area, and if both stopped without clear reason, the possibility that one of them was connected to Claire's disappearance couldn't be ignored. The third witness was a young man living farther west. He was driving home late and remembered seeing a white cargo van moving unusually slowly, almost inching along. At the time he thought the driver was looking for an address, but now thinking back, he found the behavior suspicious. The van passed by, then turned around, heading toward the light-colored sedan that police later confirmed was Claire's. He wasn't sure if the van stopped, but the slow speed and erratic path were enough to put it on the list for review. The fact that 3 suspicious vehicles appeared in the same area, in the same time frame, forced police to analyze every detail closely. The presence of a pickup, a silver sedan, and a white van on the usually empty road that night wasn't coincidence, but could be signs of a chain of related events, or related to Claire. However, it was the first witness's statement about the pickup that truly shifted the investigation's tone. When asked to recall more carefully, he slowly described a detail he wasn't sure he should mention at first. As he passed, the pickup seemed to back up very close to a light-colored car, too close with the sedan's taillights barely visible under the pickup's bed. He didn't see anything else clearly, because it happened fast, but he had the feeling the pickup was trying to hide the smaller car. The investigative team fell suddenly silent upon hearing this detail. If true, it meant the pickup wasn't just randomly at the scene, but had interacted with the sedan, and might have been deliberately blocking view of the person or activity happening behind it. The formula for a vehicle block became very clear. When reconstructing the scene, a small car pulled to the shoulder, a pickup backing close to block the rear, in the dark with no one noticing, the officers understood that situation created a private space where any illegal act could happen, without passers-by spotting it. Police returned to the scene to recreate the positioning based on the description. When they tested backing a vehicle into the angle the witness described, they saw that with just a slight adjustment, the pickup would completely obscure Claire's rear from the view of oncoming traffic. One officer said quietly, "If someone was standing behind the car at that moment, no one would see them." Information about the 3 suspicious vehicles was entered into the official file, and police began circling every matching vehicle type within a 20-mile radius. They contacted repair shops, garage owners, farmers, using old 80s pickups, anyone owning a similar model. But on that morning, as the first sunlight shone on the sedan, still sitting silently by the roadside, police understood they were facing a disappearance that wasn't simple. Vehicles appearing and vanishing in the night, a fleeting scream, a faint footprint behind Claire's car. Each individual detail wasn't enough to say anything, but as they were gradually pieced together, they started forming a frame. Claire hadn't just stopped in an unreasonable spot. The presence of other vehicles suggested possible intervention from outside, and the driver of the brown pickup, if the witness's description was accurate, was very likely the last person present where Claire was separated from her life. As witnesses reported the 3 suspicious vehicles, police understood that tracking down each vehicle's owner was the first step in screening suspects. A brown 80 Shira pickup, a silver sedan stopped unusually, and a white cargo van driving slowly back and forth. Each detail could lead to a specific person, and if lucky, one of them would unlock a crucial link in solving what happened to Claire. A temporary command center was set up near the scene. There, the officer in charge compiled statements, vehicle registration data, residency records, and related reports in the area. The work took many hours and required extreme meticulousness. Any small error in data collection could send the investigation into a dead end. When the initial list of matching vehicle owners was gathered, police had a total of 8 people to verify. Some were on the list for owning old brown pickups, others for similar silver sedans, and a few for driving white cargo vans in the area. Priority levels varied, but all needed thorough checking. The first to have his alibi checked was a farmer living near Woodford County. He owned an old brown pickup he used for hauling livestock feed. At the time of Claire's disappearance, he said he was asleep at home, and his wife confirmed it. Their statements matched, and the distance from the farm to the abandoned car was too far to fit the nighttime timeline. He was quickly removed from the list. Another was a local warehouse worker who owned an old silver sedan. When questioned, he was cooperative and even brought the car in for police inspection. The odometer showed the vehicle hadn't left the garage that night, and security cameras at his workplace recorded him leaving his late shift, with the car still parked in the lot. He was also cleared of suspicion. The owner of the white cargo van was a delivery driver for a small business. The GPS on the van, though an older device, still recorded the basic route he took that night. His slow driving and looking around was just because he was trying to avoid a road under repair, not following anyone. Police verified this by comparing the route to a construction site with traffic restriction signs. He was removed from the list. 3 people were eliminated in just a few hours, but the remaining 5 weren't as easy to verify. Some had no clear alibis, others were evasive when answering questions. During interviews, one name started recurring, not in witness statements, but in the side notes of old records: Mason Langford. Mason, 34 years old, lived alone on the outskirts of Jessamine County, working as a freelance mechanic in a private garage. His name appeared in the security logs from where Claire had worked a few months before she vanished. Security noted a minor argument in the parking lot when Mason, supposedly repairing a car for one of Claire's co-workers, made inappropriate comments that made her uncomfortable. The incident died down with no official report, but that detail was enough to make police take notice. When one officer dug deeper into Mason, one piece of information stood out strongly. Mason owned a brown 80 Shira pickup, matching the witness description of the truck seen backing close to the sedan the night Claire disappeared. An officer pulled the vehicle registration records. Indeed, the pickup was early 80s, light brown long bed, an almost exact match to the description. Though hundreds of such pickups existed across Kentucky, the fact that someone who had caused a disturbance in Claire's parking lot owned the exact model seen near the scene wasn't something to overlook. The list of 8 suspects was immediately reordered, with Mason moving from 6th place to the top. Police went to Mason's workplace to ask him a few questions. The small garage was set back down a dirt road, with old cars scattered around as if waiting forever to be fixed. When he saw the police, Mason stayed calm, wiping his hands on an oily rag and stepping forward. They asked about the brown pickup. Mason said the truck was running fine but wasn't used last night. When asked if he was home during the time Claire disappeared, Mason replied that he was resting at home and hadn't gone out. But when police asked for confirmation from someone who could verify, Mason hesitated. "I live alone, no one's there to confirm." That didn't prove he did anything wrong, but it also didn't help clear him. One officer asked about the parking lot argument a few months back. Mason snorted, "Just a misunderstanding. I was fixing someone's car, she walked by, said something rude, and, whatever, not worth mentioning." He denied any real conflict with Claire. Though Mason's voice didn't waver, his demeanor was slightly tense, as if afraid of being linked to something bigger. Everything was noted in the report. As police left the garage, One officer glanced back at the brown pickup parked in the shade of the tin roof. Faded paint, thick dust cover, but the shape of the truck sitting there sent a slight chill down his spine. With just one driver with bad intentions, a pickup like that could easily back up to Claire's rear, creating a barrier separating her from the view of passers-by, exactly as the witness described. The other 4 suspects remained on the initial list, but none had the combination of *no alibi, *prior minor conflict contact with Claire, and especially owning the exact model vehicle seen near the scene. As afternoon fell, police held a quick meeting at the scene. One officer said, "We don't have charging evidence yet, but clearly Langford has a lot of points to follow up on." Another added, "He lives not far from here, and no one can prove he wasn't here last night." That statement was recorded in the minutes as a warning. In a missing persons case, sometimes just one small detail, a nameless pickup, a seemingly insignificant disturbance, can become the spark that turns the entire investigation in a new direction. And at this moment, every road seemed to be leading gradually toward the name Mason Langford. Claire's disappearance dragged into the new year with no further clues. Continuous expanded searches were deployed, from dense forests and riverbanks to abandoned areas between Fayette County and Jessamine County. But all returned the same sad conclusion: no trace of Claire. Her family had to face a painful void, no evidence she was alive, but nothing proving she was dead, a disappearance hanging suspended in midair, with no footing. By mid-1988, when Tennessee weather was entering its dry hot days, an event occurred more than 100 miles south of Lexington. A group of hunters happened into the Royal Blue Wildlife Management Area, a vast region with dense forests, hills, and complex terrain. While tracking deer signs, they spotted a group of wild animals gathered around an unusual area. When they approached, they discovered the heavily decomposed body of a female. The report was sent immediately to Tennessee police. When Claiborne County investigators arrived at the scene, they quickly determined it was the body of a young woman, with height and age matching Claire's. But that was just initial impressions. No identification, no personal items to help identify her. Her identity could only be temporarily recorded as Jane Doe. The woman's body was transported to the Knoxville Medical Examiner's office for autopsy. Although the level of decomposition obscured many details, several characteristics were still recorded. Height approximately 5'5" inches to 5'6", long brown or dark black hair, discolored by environmental exposure, some signs of old fractures in the facial area, and no jewelry or clear identifying markers. What particularly drew attention was the location. The Royal Blue WMA area was extremely remote, with difficult trails and few chance visitors. This made the suspicion of foul play far more reasonable than the possibility that the victim had come here on her own. When the initial details were entered into the Tennessee State Police system, the investigation commander decided to send the information to neighboring states, including Kentucky, where a young woman with similar characteristics had gone missing the previous year. At the Lexington Police Department, the name Claire Whitmore was immediately placed alongside the Tennessee Jane Doe file for comparison. At first, several factors drew the Kentucky investigators' attention: similar age, similar height, and an estimated time of death that could align with the period when Claire disappeared. But then one of the key details sent everything in another direction: clothing. The Tennessee victim was wearing an outfit completely different from what Claire had worn the night she vanished. In the initial report, Claire left work wearing light blue medical scrubs and a thin jacket, but Jane Doe wore jeans and a t-shirt, clothing inconsistent with someone in the medical field coming off a shift. This discrepancy led the Tennessee investigators to conclude the cases were unrelated. They eliminated Claire almost immediately. At that time, the decision seemed reasonable, but later, it would be considered one of the critical mistakes that prolonged Claire's case for decades. Because in the real world of criminal investigations, victims are often redressed by offenders or stripped of their original clothing for various reasons, from concealing identity to destroying DNA. But in 1988, this knowledge was not yet systematized or widely communicated. Another detail made everything even more suspicious: the Tennessee Jane Doe autopsy report was missing a page. When the documents were sent to Kentucky for reference, they noticed the behavioral indicators and lower body condition sections, typically describing injuries, decomposition levels, and estimated body positioning at death, were not included. No one could explain why that page was missing. Some Tennessee investigators insisted the omission happened due to a typing or filing error. Another said the page was never sent, but someone else remembered the original report being complete and believed the crucial page had been lost during copying or local storage. Whatever the reason, the disappearance of that important report page left Kentucky investigators without enough basis to request deeper comparison, and the Jane Doe file was set aside. They continued searching for Claire as a separate missing person, unaware that the Tennessee body had similarities worth pursuing. A Kentucky officer later recalled, "If we'd had that page in 1988, the case might have gone in a completely different direction." A minor omission, mismatched clothing, a missing report page, seemingly trivial details that caused two cases close in time and victim profile to become two separate files for many years. Jane Doe in Tennessee was buried under a number. Claire in Kentucky remained listed as missing, and the path that would eventually connect the two fates would not open again for many decades. But in 1988, they were merely two scattered fragments of a puzzle no one knew belonged to the same picture. After Tennessee ruled out the possibility that Jane Doe was Claire, the Kentucky case fell into a state of limbo. All critical leads had been examined: the abandoned car, the faint shoe prints behind it, information about 3 suspicious vehicles, and a potential suspect, Mason Langford. But nothing was strong enough to create a breakthrough. No body, no direct witnesses, no clear physical evidence, no DNA evidence by the standards of the time. Each page of the file was analyzed repeatedly by different teams. Every investigator tried to uncover a new angle, hoping to find a detail someone else had missed. But Claire's case gradually became an example of files trapped between insufficient evidence and insufficient direction. You know something terrible happened, but you don't have enough to prove it. By late 1989, the case was officially classified as a cold case. It wasn't fully closed, but no dedicated investigative unit monitored it regularly anymore. Claire's family continued calling the police department periodically, hoping the search would reopen, but those calls grew less frequent, not because they gave up, but because they no longer knew what more they could ask. Even so, not every officer was willing to let the case simply fade. One of the younger officers at Lexington PD, who had been present the morning the car was found, would occasionally pull out old evidence to examine it again. He was particularly interested in the patch of gravel stuck under Claire's car, which had been noted but never analyzed in depth. As the case cooled, he requested permission to take the soil sample to the geology lab at the University of Kentucky. The goal wasn't to solve the case immediately. No one believed that dirt sample held any major secret, but simply to see whether its geological origin could be identified. The results left him standing still for a long moment. The mineral composition in the sample did not match any soil type recorded in Fayette County. Fayette County was known for its dark brown clay-mixed soil, while the sample from Claire's car contained significant pyrite and bright gray crushed rock, an uncommon component for the road where the car was found. This meant one thing: Claire's car had driven somewhere else before being abandoned on Old Frankfort Pike. But where? At that time, tools for soil comparison were extremely limited. There were no large databases, no detailed mineral maps like those available later. The soil sample was simply placed back into the file, with a note "does not match primary scene." No one knew what else to do, until one day in early 1992, when a Tennessee officer heard about the sample during a federal interagency meeting. He suggested comparing it with soil collected from the Royal Blue Wildlife Management Area, the place where the Jane Doe body had been found. No one expected anything significant, but 2 weeks later, the lab sent a report. The mineral composition in the Tennessee soil sample and the soil from Claire's car showed a very high degree of similarity. Specifically, pyrite content, the mix of dark shale and pale yellow mineral granules, characteristic of the northern Tennessee hills. This was not enough to confirm Claire had ever been at Royal Blue WMA, but it was enough to show her car might have entered a region with similar soil, an area not far from where Jane Doe was found. This was the second time Tennessee and Kentucky had a result, suggesting a connection between the two cases. But 1992 was not yet the moment for that result to change everything. Why? Because Kentucky police still believed the clothing on Jane Doe did not match Claire's description, and because the missing autopsy page continued to prevent a complete picture. Investigators saw the coincidences, but no one felt confident enough to declare the two victims were the same person. Stewart County also declined to expand the investigation without stronger identifying data. The soil sample was placed back into the file. A small note was added, geological similarity to northern Tennessee, but afterward, the file went quiet again. New cases, new demands, new disappearances occupied everyone's attention. Between 1989 and 1995, Claire's file sat on the cold case shelf, occasionally reviewed by an officer, but nothing strong enough emerged to bring it back to the center of the desk. The case was like a half-open door, letting wind pass through but no one knowing how hard to push for it to swing wide. If anything remained, it was the lingering, persistent question from the officer who had compared the soil. Why does Claire's car have Tennessee-like soil? That question, though unanswered for decades, would eventually return like inevitability, guiding them to the final truth. But in the 1990s, everything was still clouded in the fog of a cold file, where scattered clues were recorded, but not yet connectable. Claire remained missing. Jane Doe remained unnamed, and the two cases continued to exist in parallel, like two mysterious currents waiting for modern science to merge them into one. In the late 1980s, through the early 1990s, missing person and highway assault cases began to be aggregated by investigative agencies to support criminal behavioral analysis. This was when law enforcement across the U.S. started to recognize that scattered cases, seemingly unrelated, could actually be pieces of a larger pattern. In Kentucky, the region near the I-75 corridor, a major artery stretching from Michigan to Florida, was considered a risk-prone corridor. The area had recorded multiple incidents of victims being stopped, forced off the road, or disappearing without a trace. Each incident was usually investigated at the county level, but when viewed collectively, shared characteristics began to emerge. A special investigative group within the Kentucky State Police (KSP) was tasked with reviewing roadside abductions across Fayette, Jessamine, Madison, and Clark County, all within the range Claire could have traveled. The goal wasn't to prove Claire was part of a pattern, but to see whether any similar model existed that might suggest a new investigative direction. Among the cases they examined, 3 were marked as bearing notable similarities. The first occurred in 1986, when a college student was forced to stop on a dark stretch near Richmond. She reported a dark pickup tailgating her, then pulling ahead and forcing her to the shoulder. The man exited and tried to approach her car, but she locked the doors and fled. She described the pickup as having a large scratch on the rear bed, but couldn't recall the plate. The second occurred in 1989, when a young woman reported being followed for miles by a mysterious driver. The vehicle was a silver sedan that remained directly behind her at a red light. For so long she grew uneasy. When she changed lanes, the sedan immediately followed. She eventually sped into a busy gas station. The man stood at the entrance briefly watching her before leaving. She never learned who he was. The third occurred in 1990, and it was the only one with a more detailed plate description. A woman was forced to stop on a side road near I-75 by a dark or brown pickup. The driver attempted to open her door, but she locked it and screamed. He attacked the window before fleeing when another vehicle approached. She clearly remembered the plate starting with JX. For anyone living in Kentucky, JX wasn't unusual. It indicated a vehicle registered in Jessamine County. But for police, it was significant, because one name on their suspect list also came from Jessamine County: Mason Langford, the mechanic who owned a brown 1980s pickup. Although the third case occurred 3 years after Claire disappeared, the description of the pickup and the driver's behavior contained striking overlaps: the prolonged pursuit, forcing the victim to the shoulder, and the aggressive attempt to access the victim's vehicle. The investigators could not ignore these similarities. They could not prove the 1990 driver was Mason, but the detail that the plate came from Jessamine County pushed them to revisit a lead they had once considered a dead end. A senior KSP officer reviewing the cases said, "No one is claiming these three incidents are connected, but sometimes the clue isn't in perfect similarity, it's in the sense of a shared shadow pattern." When Claire's file was placed alongside these cases, no one could say definitively that Mason was involved. But the overlaps, brown pickup, Jessamine County, and pursuit behavior made Mason more than just one of 8 suspects. He became the most notable suspect. Police tried to check Mason's vehicle registration during the 1990 incident, but record keeping at the time was inconsistent. Nothing proved he was at the scene. No witnesses confirmed it, no traffic cameras, no physical trace. Once again, everything stopped at suspicion. Yet one detail from the 1990 report chilled investigators when they reread it. The victim in the JX case said that when the pickup reversed close to her car, she saw the driver's silhouette walking behind my vehicle, as if trying to hide something in the dark. To police, that phrasing carried a haunting familiarity. It echoed the witness description of the pickup on the night Claire disappeared. Though there was no direct evidence, something about the series of incidents made it difficult to dismiss Mason Langford from investigators' minds. But lacking advanced technology, DNA, expanded interstate comparisons, or strong connections, the suspicion could go no further. As the 1990s passed, the cases remained in the files, preserved, but never fully connected. The floating fragments had no place to lock together. Claire Whitmore was still missing. Tennessee's Jane Doe still had no name. Mason Langford continued living his life in Jessamine County, and along the I-75 corridor, stories of cars being followed, women being forced onto the shoulder, or screams in the night, were still occasionally reported. But they were like sounds carried away by the wind, heard, yet no one could find where they began. What no one could have guessed was this: these separate fragments would eventually come together many years later, when modern DNA technology finally became capable of illuminating a truth that human eyes had missed for nearly 3 decades. Moving into the early 2000s, as traditional DNA analysis began to improve, many police departments across the United States proactively reviewed old case files to see whether previously unusable samples might now yield new results. The disappearance of Claire Whitmore, though nearly 15 years cold, always remained on the priority list due to its unusual nature, and because her family had never given up their search. The evidence file was pulled for another review. Among the items, the one that drew the most attention was not Claire's car, which had already been thoroughly processed in 1987, but rather a small fabric sample and a very faint smear collected from the back seat during the final sweep in 1989. At the time, the sample was too minimal, and the technology not advanced enough to extract any useful DNA. But in 2002, when a lab partnering with the Kentucky State Police offered to retest it using newer techniques, a door opened. The sample was sent under updated preservation protocols, cleaned, amplified, and run through multiple complex processes. The technicians did not expect much. DNA degrades over time, especially when evidence has been exposed to the fluctuating heat and cold of a car interior. But after 3 weeks of analysis, they discovered something surprising: a weak but detectable YSTR signal. YSTR is a form of DNA specific to the male line, passed from father to son with minimal change. In cases without a full DNA profile, it is often the last resort technique to trace the male lineage of whoever left the trace. The result led the lab to rerun the test 4 more times. Even though the DNA quantity was extremely small, each run produced the same YSTR pattern, a distinctive sequence not matching any data investigators had previously logged. The report was sent to Lexington PD, and when the investigative team opened it, the room seemed to freeze. For the first time in years, they had biological evidence tied to Claire's disappearance. The team immediately began comparing the YSTR to familial data within population records. Although there was nothing like today's broad DNA databases, Kentucky did maintain some male line genetic markers from large local families, collected for demographic research projects. When the cross-check was completed, one surname surfaced, Langford. This stirred up intense discussion within the team, because the name Langford was already familiar. It matched the last name of Mason Langford, the owner of the brown pickup, who had been considered the primary suspect many years earlier. Still, neither the law nor investigative protocols allowed them to jump to conclusions based solely on a faint YSTR result. YSTR cannot pinpoint an individual, only that the person who left the trace belongs to the same male line. That meant the DNA sample could have come from Mason, or a male cousin, or someone else in the Langford family, living in Jessamine County. This was progress, but also a major limitation. YSTR does not have the individualizing power of autosomal DNA. Two men in the same family can share all or nearly all of the same YSTR markers. An officer reopened the Langford file. Mason had an older brother and two uncles, living in the surrounding area. None of them had appeared in the 1987 file, because there had been no direct conflict with Claire, and none owned a vehicle matching the original witness description, other than Mason. But this meant that rather than narrowing suspects, the YSTR result forced them to broaden the suspect pool to the entire male branch of the Langford family. During a team meeting after the results came in, an older investigator said, "This is a precious puzzle piece, but it doesn't show us the face. It only tells us the person belongs to a family." The statement was so accurate that it left the room in silence. Even so, the reappearance of the Langford name could not be dismissed as mere coincidence. Ever since the late 1980s, the investigation had circled around Mason due to his behavior in the parking lot, the brown pickup, and the unanswered questions about his lack of a clear alibi the night Claire disappeared. Now, an additional DNA trace, small as it was, pushed them back to the starting point of their suspicions. But once again, as with every development in this case, during that era, everything got stuck. Not enough evidence to obtain a search warrant, not enough DNA to conclude anything, no new witnesses, no way to determine exactly who in the Langford line had left the sample. The case slipped back into cold status after a brief flare of activity. This time though, unlike in previous years, investigators felt they had gotten one step closer, a small fragile step, still far from unlocking the mystery, but enough to plant a belief in their minds that whoever had touched Claire's car belonged to the Langford family. What no one expected was this: nearly 20 years later, that faint YSTR would become the first building block leading to the path of forensic genealogy, opening the door to finally breaking the case. But in 2002, it was only a question hanging from the ceiling of the police department, clear, unsettling, but not yet solid enough to be called truth. In early 2010, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation (TBI) launched a review campaign for long-standing unidentified victim cases. Among more than 100 files re-evaluated, one of the most prominent names was that of the woman found in 1988 at the Royal Blue Wildlife Management Area. The woman investigators at the time could only refer to with a cold label, Jane Doe. Advances in microtrace analysis and environmental DNA by the late 2000s allowed investigators to re-examine details once thought too minor to matter. The Knoxville Medical Examiner's Office received the remains again, not for a new autopsy, but to analyze environmental traces on the remaining fabric and tissue. During the review, a young technician noticed something odd in the soil sample taken from a scrap of fabric still attached to Jane Doe's body. The color and mineral structure looked familiar. It reminded him of the geological analysis Kentucky had submitted back in 1992, something he had read in an internal report a few months earlier. Curious, he compared the two samples, a simple act no one had taken since the case had gone cold. The similarity was clear. The pyrite levels were nearly identical, the dark shale composition was the same, and there were traces of pale yellow minerals characteristic of the Tennessee mountain region. This indicated that Jane Doe had soil on her consistent with what had been found under Claire's car. Looking even closer, the forensics team discovered a small gray-brown synthetic fiber near the pant area of Jane Doe. Under the microscope, its structure matched the type of material found in Claire's car more than 20 years earlier, a fabric often used in the upholstery of older pickup truck seats. These details did not yet form hard proof, but they were the investigative scent that made Tennessee investigators feel that the 1988 Jane Doe might not be an isolated file at all. She might be the missing piece from another case, the case of a young woman who disappeared in Kentucky in 1987. When this information was sent to Lexington PD, Kentucky investigators took notice immediately. Although they had previously ruled out Jane Doe due to the clothing mismatch, time and experience had made them more cautious. In many cases, offenders change a victim's clothes to remove traces. What had once been treated as a contradiction was now something entirely explainable. From there, federal and state agencies began working together to recheck all records related to Claire Whitmore and Jane Doe. Tennessee police sent facial bone images of Jane Doe to a Kentucky medical examiner for comparison. While reviewing them, a detail that had been overlooked before suddenly stood out: an old fracture on Jane Doe's nasal bridge, healed but leaving it slightly off-center. When compared to Claire's medical records, documents her family had provided in the early days of the investigation, the examiner saw the same thing. Claire had broken her nose in 1983, during a sports collision in high school. The injury had healed, but left a slight misalignment in the exact position and form reflected in Jane Doe's nasal bones. No one in the meeting needed to say the conclusion out loud. The tension in the room was enough for everyone to understand that this was no coincidence. A veteran TBI investigator set his pen down and sighed. "Looks like we missed this for more than 20 years. The match in old injury patterns was not absolute proof, but combined with the soil and fabric evidence, the possibility that Jane Doe was Claire was no longer small. It had become a line of inquiry both states were now obligated to pursue fully. Kentucky formally requested further comparison of remaining evidence, and Tennessee agreed to expand the analyses. Hair, bone, and fabric samples were sent to an advanced DNA lab, with the hope of extracting mitochondrial DNA, micDNA, which can persist even when nuclear DNA has broken down. As technicians began the first stages of testing, Lexington PD investigators sat down again with Claire's file, marking details that had been nearly forgotten over 20 years: the car's illogical travel path, the strange soil, the unusual silence of the night she vanished, and the Langford name resurfacing in the 2002 YSTR finding. Amid all these data points, one picture emerged like a faint silhouette that could no longer be ignored. Claire might not have disappeared in Kentucky. She might have been taken across state lines, to Tennessee, and her body might have been found in 1988, long before technology was ready to recognize that truth. But comparing soil fibers and injury patterns still wasn't enough to put a final period on the case. Every conclusion needed something stronger: DNA. And in 2010, as technology finally grew capable, the investigation was about to enter a phase that could rewrite the entire history of the case. Claire Whitmore might soon be found, not as a missing person, but as an identity finally given back to Tennessee's Jane Doe, after more than 2 decades of silence in the mountains. 6 years after Tennessee reopened the Jane Doe file, forensic science had advanced even further. Techniques once seen as far future had become standard in modern labs, especially mtDNA analysis and the ability to process highly degraded, low-quantity DNA. From 2014 to 2016, a federal program was launched to support the identification of long-term unidentified victims. The Royal Blue Jane Doe was on the priority list. When the file was reviewed, technicians immediately requested re-extraction from preserved bone samples from 1988, this time using a cleaner, more sensitive mitochondrial DNA protocol. mtDNA, unlike nuclear DNA, exists in thousands of copies per cell. Even when soft tissue is completely decomposed, mtDNA can survive in bone or teeth, allowing investigators to track a victim's maternal line. For old cases, it is one of the most powerful tools available. When Jane Doe's bone fragments went into the new extraction system, Many in the lab held their breath for the first results. After nearly 30 years, would any viable DNA remain? The answer was yes, and more than they had hoped for. mtDNA from bone, the signature of the maternal line. The mtDNA sample was clear enough for full analysis. When submitted for comparison, the result that appeared on the screen left the forensic team silent for several seconds. Jane Doe's mtDNA matched the haplogroup recorded in the Whitmore family's file. This could not by itself confirm identity, but it was a strong indicator. mtDNA does not change across generations on the maternal line. If Jane Doe shared a rare haplogroup with the Whitmore family, it strongly suggested they belonged to the same maternal line. Kentucky PD was notified immediately. They provided mtDNA samples from Claire's close relatives, her sister and her mother, for direct comparison. When the results returned, there was no more room for doubt. Jane Doe's mtDNA matched Claire Whitmore's maternal line. Not everyone who shares mtDNA is the same individual, but for a 28-year-old Jane Doe case, this was the strongest evidence yet. Even so, mtDNA only confirmed that the victim likely belonged to the Whitmore line, not that she was definitively Claire. Another step was needed. Terror from the evidence. A voice from the past. In 2016, the Kentucky lab also reanalyzed the Terror sample, first obtained in 2002 from Claire's car. Modern technology allowed for far cleaner, more precise amplification. This time, the Terror profile was clearer, more stable. The sequence made it possible to compare against multiple family clusters in the area, building a genetic map of male lineages across Jessamine and Fayette County. The result showed something investigators could not look away from. Terror from Claire's car consistently pointed to the Langford male line with over 90% probability. This reinforced the suspicion that the man present around Claire's car the night she disappeared belonged to the Langford family, a detail that had haunted the case since 1987. But to confirm that Jane Doe was Claire, the investigators needed something else. A direct mtDNA comparison between Jane Doe and Claire's relatives. When the mtDNA reference line was plotted, every eye in the room turned to the screen. Jane Doe's mtDNA sequence matched. Claire's mother's mtDNA sequence matched. Claire's sister's mtDNA sequence matched. For mtDNA analysis, this was the highest level of concordance possible. Genealogical screening, the final piece. With both mtDNA from Jane Doe and Terror from Claire's evidence, a new idea emerged. Conduct a semi-manual genealogical screening, a method still being pioneered in labs at the time. They ran Jane Doe's mtDNA sequence through a limited genetic genealogy database to see which families in Kentucky and Tennessee it appeared in. Every step was taken under strict legal oversight to comply with data protection regulations. When the family tree chart came up, one name line stood out at the center: Whitmore, Jessamine County, Fayette County. Genealogical screening showed Jane Doe's mtDNA sequence had an 80% probability of belonging to the Whitmore maternal line, and within the Whitmore family in 1987, only one woman was missing: Claire Whitmore, 23 years old. The genealogical result did not declare Jane Doe as definitely Claire, but it established a probability so strong it could not be ignored. A Tennessee investigator wrote in the report, "At this point, every scientific indicator leads to a single common point. If Jane Doe is not Claire Whitmore, then we are witnessing a statistical coincidence, rarer than winning the lottery." A truth about to emerge. When Kentucky received the full report, the investigative team spent nearly an hour reading every line. Many on the team had followed the case from the beginning, had witnessed Claire's family wait in exhaustion and grief. Some had retired, some had transferred, but Claire's file still sat like an irritating ripple in the memory of the department. Now, after 29 years, they stood at the threshold of a truth that science was finally capable of illuminating: mtDNA matching the Whitmore maternal line, 80% genealogical probability. Matching fabric from a pickup truck seat soil consistent with samples from Royal Blue, a nasal fracture pattern identical to Claire's medical records. Not one, not two, but a series of indicators linking two lives that had seemed separate into one. Claire Whitmore and Tennessee Jane Doe, but the big question still stood there like a shadow. If Jane Doe really was Claire, who took her to Tennessee, who left the Langford YS tier in her car, and who had lived nearly 3 decades without ever coming under serious suspicion again, the answer would come, but not through traditional techniques. It would require modern forensic genealogy, and the investigation was about to enter a phase unlike anything that had come before. In 2018, the United States witnessed a turning point that completely changed how cases were solved. Forensic genealogy. Genetic genealogy applied to criminal investigation became the new weapon of forensic science. That was the year labs like Parabon Nanolabs and Othram stepped into the center of the investigative stage, helping crack cases that had seemed unsolvable for decades. In that context, the Tennessee Jane Doe file, suspected to be Claire Whitmore, was sent to Othram, a lab with superior technology for extracting highly degraded DNA, capable of rebuilding genomes from the most damaged samples. Investigators in Kentucky and Tennessee understood that if any place could answer this 30-year-old mystery, it was Othram. DNA extraction by 2018 standards, what was once impossible, had become standard. Jane Doe's bone samples, which had previously yielded only partial mitochondrial DNA, were run through an extraction process using enzymatic techniques and next-generation sequencing (NGS). During this process, thousands of tiny DNA fragments were recovered, assembled, and cleaned using machine learning algorithms. A technician at Othram recalled, "We spent almost a month just to build a sequence long enough for genealogy, but every fragment restored was one step closer for Claire to get her real name back." At the same time, the YSTR sample from Claire's car evidence, already cleaner after the 2016 analysis, was sent over for comparison with the relevant male family line. Building the family tree, when the maternal and paternal lines tell the same story. Once the final data were entered into the system, Othram began building a two-directional genealogy, mtDNA, to trace the maternal line, YSTR, to trace the paternal line or the man who had been in Claire's car, maternal line result, mtDNA. As the family tree expanded across multiple generations, only one family in all of central Kentucky carried the same rare mtDNA haplogroup as Jane Doe, the Whitmore family. The chart displayed before the analysts showed 3 timelines converging: Claire missing 19, Jane Doe found 1988, the Whitmore maternal line perfect mtDNA match. Othram's conclusion was written in the official report. The mtDNA and genealogical data indicate that Jane Doe belongs to the Whitmore maternal line with a probability 99%. Among the women in this maternal line, only one was reported missing: Claire Whitmore. After 31 years, Jane Doe's identity finally had a name. Jane Doe =sign Claire Whitmore. Tennessee and Kentucky jointly signed to confirm it. The missing person file officially became a homicide file. But everyone knew identity was only half the answer. Who took Claire to Royal Blue? Othram turned to the paternal side data. YSTR genealogy. 2 Langford brothers under the harsh light of science. When the YSTR was run through the comparison system, the software not only analyzed genetic markers, but also assessed generational variation in the male line. The result quickly revealed something familiar. The YSTR profile belonged to the Langford male line. But this time, 2018-era technology was strong enough to pinpoint a specific branch of the family, not just the shared surname as in 2002. The family tree displayed 2 prominent branches: Branch 1 Mason Langford, Branch 2 Thomas Langford, Mason's older brother. Both belonged to the same base YSTR group, but when analysts dug into the secondary markers, the new generation STR set, something critical appeared on the screen. The YSTR profile from Claire's car aligned more closely with Thomas Langford's branch, not Mason's. This was a result no one on the Kentucky investigative team had ever considered. They had suspected Mason for 3 decades because of the brown 1980s pickup, the minor confrontation in the parking lot, and his lack of a clear alibi. But no one had paid attention to the older brother, the quieter one, less social, and therefore less noticed. Othram sent an addendum. The probability that the YSTR sample belongs to the branch of Thomas Langford is 7 times higher than for Mason Langford. That number did not convict anyone, but it opened a completely new path. Expanded investigation. When a man's silence becomes evidence. When police reviewed the records, they found in 1987, Thomas Langford was 28 years old, living with Mason in Jessamine County. There was no record of him ever interacting with Claire, but he worked as a driver for a lumber company, frequently traveling the Kentucky-Tennessee route, including the area near Royal Blue WMA. Crucially, he had no valid alibi for the night. Claire disappeared. In the old reports, Thomas had said he was asleep at home, but no one could verify that. Mason wasn't home that night either, so their statements could not corroborate each other. An investigator wrote in the supplemental report, "For more than 3 decades, we focused on Mason because of the truck, but no one asked who was driving that truck that night." A simple question, but it had never been asked with enough force in 30 years, and now, DNA was forcing everyone to confront it. The crucial decision, officially establishing Jane Doe as Claire. After fully reviewing the data, DNA, the genealogical findings, the Langford YSTR branch, the nasal fracture pattern, the soil and fiber consistency, and the fact that Claire vanished along the same route, Thomas regularly drove. Authorities in Tennessee and Kentucky signed a joint declaration. The 1988 Royal Blue Jane Doe is Claire Whitmore. The case was officially reclassified as a homicide. Claire's family was invited to police headquarters. When the announcement was made, her mother asked a single simple question: "So all these years, my girl was lying in Tennessee?" No one could answer. From here there was only one direction left: find the person who took Claire to Royal Blue. Confirming the victim's identity was only the first step. Othram sent an additional guidance report. The YSTR branch belongs to the Langford male line, with the highest fit for Thomas Langford. We recommend focusing the investigation on this individual. Thomas Langford, the name that for 30 years had never been placed at the center, now stepped abruptly out of the shadow of the file, standing directly under the cold light of science. And as investigators began to dig into Thomas's residence, employment, travel routes, and behavioral history, everything started to align with Claire's timeline in a chilling way. Thomas did not just live near Claire, he did not just drive the right route, he did not just belong to the right YSTR line, he was also the one man whose alibi no one could truly verify. One door closes, Jane Doe's identity, another door opens. The suspect Thomas Langford's science has given Jane Doe her name back. But it has also brought back the question, which man with the last name Langford took Claire to her death? After Jane Doe's identity was confirmed as Claire Whitmore, the investigation entered a phase the investigators called forensic reconstruction, rebuilding the entire journey from the moment Claire left work to when her body was found in Tennessee. The goal was not only to understand what happened, but to prove in court that there was a consistent, coherent, undeniable chain of events, and to do that, they had to start from the last place Claire was alive. Starting point, Lexington Clinic, 9:10 p.m. Claire finished her shift and walked out of the parking lot in her light blue medical scrubs. The last co-workers to see her said she did not seem worried and had no special plans. Investigators defined this as the T-0 moment, the starting mark for all analysis. Expected route, Old Frankfort Pike. Claire always took this road home, never changed routes. The location where her car was found that night in 1987 raised a question: why was the car parked at the darkest stretch, about 12 miles from her home, in a place where she had no reason to stop? In 2018, when the route was put into movement analysis software, investigators noticed that the section where Claire stopped was a point where it's easy to be forced onto the shoulder, with no lighting, little traffic, and extremely convenient for a pickup to roll in behind her without being noticed. This was a classic roadside abduction pattern, matching 3 similar cases along I-75 during that period. Trace inside Claire's car, the pickup seat fragment. In 1989, when Claire's car was examined one last time before being placed in storage, technicians collected a very small synthetic fiber, believed to be from the seat of an older type of pickup. At that time, it was dismissed because it wasn't enough for comparison. In 2016, when the case was reviewed, this fiber was put through microfiber spectroscopy. The results showed the fiber belonged to a 1970s, 80s pickup seat line, made from polyester blended with acrylic, and more importantly, the weave had a herringbone blend pattern, found only in a few less common seat models. In 2018, when Othram built the Langford branch genealogy, a Kentucky investigator asked, between the two Langford brothers, who owned a pickup from that era. DMV records showed, Mason had owned a brown 1980 pickup, but Thomas had also owned a 1978 pickup, same color tone, which he sold in 1990. Thomas's truck no longer existed, but the insurance records noted a torn seat panel that was temporarily replaced in 1986 with a specific type of material, the exact kind of fabric found in Claire's car. When seat fabric photos from the insurance file were compared to the physical sample from Claire's car, the results showed a 100% match in fiber type and weave pattern. For the first time in 36 years, investigators had physical evidence linking the suspect's vehicle to Claire's car. No longer genealogy, no longer inference. This was physical evidence. The journey after Claire stopped the car, when Claire was forced to stop, most likely by a pickup backing up close behind her as witnesses had described. Investigators used a force transfer model to reconstruct the likely scenario. Claire was approached from behind, forced out of her car, placed into a pickup, and removed from Old Frankfort Pike within no more than 3 minutes. The pickup seat fiber in Claire's car suggests that during the struggle, Claire may have leaned or been pushed into the pickup's rear seat, causing the fiber to adhere to her clothing or body, then fall back into her own car when she was transferred between vehicles. The next likely route was identified as a side road leading to I-75, then straight toward Tennessee. The distance from where Claire's car was abandoned to the forest, where the body was found, is about 9,100 miles. If driven at night on empty roads, the pickup could reach Royal Blue WMA in just 1 hour and 45 minutes. This time frame fits with the screams a witness reported hearing in a nearby area, Claire's complete disappearance, with no one seeing her again, and the estimated decomposition timeline of Jane Doe in 1988. Entering Tennessee, Royal Blue WMA. Royal Blue is a rugged mountain forest area, hard to access, half wilderness, half exposed quarry. This is not a place one ends up by accident, but for Thomas Langford, a man who hauled timber and construction materials, the story was very different. Route maps from the company Thomas once worked for showed he frequently drove the Kentucky-Tennessee route and had gone at least twice into the Royal Blue WMA area to deliver materials for a trail improvement project in 1986, 1987. He knew the roads, he knew the terrain, and he knew the places no one else went. When the likely route of the pickup was compared with the location where Jane Doe was found, the alignment was almost exact. It was not just possible, but highly likely, that Thomas took Claire to the very place he had been before. Reassembling the entire journey. When the timeline was rebuilt, it formed a continuous arrow, 9:10 p.m. Lexington. Claire leaves work, 9:25 p.m. Old Frankfort Pike. Pickup backs up close behind Claire's car, 9:26, 9:28 p.m. Claire is subdued and placed into the pickup, 9:35 p.m. Pickup turns onto a side road leading to I-75, 10 p.m. 11:10 p.m. Travel across the Kentucky-Tennessee border, approximately 11:15 p.m. Pickup enters Royal Blue WMA, 1988. The body is found, 2010-2018. DNA and genealogy confirm the body is Claire. The single fiber left behind in Claire's car, the pickup seat fiber from Thomas's truck, fits perfectly into its place in the timeline. An investigator said in a meeting, "We used to think this case could never be pieced together, but looking at this timeline, Claire has told us her entire journey, using nothing but soil, fabric, and bone, from suspicion to truth, with matching mtDNA, matching YSTR with Thomas's branch, a matching seat fabric fragment, and a route that makes sense down to the minute. the case was no longer about suspicion. It became a structured narrative, a journey that could not be dismissed as coincidence. 36 years later, Claire's path was reconstructed, clear, sharp, and cold, like the evidence time had unknowingly preserved. But one question remained unanswered. Where is Thomas Langford now? And more importantly, is he still alive to face the truth? After the 36-year journey was pieced together, and every trace pointed toward Thomas Langford, the most difficult question facing investigators was, how do you prove that modern DNA evidence connects directly to Thomas, and not just to the Langford family? NIT DNA showed Jane Doe was Claire. YSTAR showed the male trace in Claire's car fit Thomas's branch more strongly than Mason's. The seat fabric fragment showed that the pickup Thomas once owned had been present in Claire's car, but to obtain an arrest warrant, they needed autosomal DNA, an absolute identifier. To get that, they had to collect Thomas's DNA without him knowing he was being watched. And like many historic cases solved in the forensic genealogy era, investigators decided to take a familiar but risky step, a DNA trap, covertly collecting DNA from items the suspect discarded. Locating Thomas and choosing how to collect the sample. At the time, 59-year-old Thomas Langford was living a quiet life on the outskirts of Nicholasville, in a small house at the end of a dirt road, isolated and drawing little attention. He no longer owned the old pickup, something that made police both relieved the vehicle could not be manipulated as planted evidence, and frustrated they could not gather more fibers or scent traces from the original truck. A surveillance team was formed, consisting of 3 Kentucky investigators and 2 FBI agents, officers experienced in covert DNA collection operations. They observed Thomas's habits, having coffee on the porch in the morning, fixing things in the garage around noon, going to a local convenience store in the afternoon, walking alone in the evening. Most importantly, Thomas had a habit of tossing soda cans or paper coffee cups into a public trash bin in front of a small store 3 minutes' drive from his house. In most states, items discarded in public are no longer considered private property, allowing police to collect them without a search warrant. Investigators decided this would be the DNA trap, the sample collection moment. On a June morning in 2019, Thomas bought a can of Dr. Pepper at his usual convenience store. He drank it in the parking lot, leaning against his car, then threw the can into the metal trash bin by the door. 2 minutes after Thomas left, an FBI agent walked up to the trash can, put on gloves, retrieved the can into an evidence bag, and quickly got into the waiting car. It was a tiny moment, but in the world of forensic science, it had the power to change the fate of an entire case. The sample was sealed, labeled LP01, and sent to Othram's laboratory. Autosomal DNA analysis, the decisive step. Othram used an oral contact DNA extraction protocol, typically targeting saliva residue left on the can. Thanks to next-generation contaminant filtering technology, they obtained an almost complete autosomal profile, sufficient for direct comparison with the previous mtDNA and YSTR, but more importantly, sufficient for comparison with the sample from Claire's car. When the data were entered into the system, the software began a 3-layer matching process, YSTR comparison, to see whether the sample belonged to the already identified Langford branch. Autosomal comparison, to compare with the faint DNA trace found in Claire's car. Supplementary comparison, to cross-check against any unidentified DNA samples collected from evidence related to Jane Doe's remains. When the chart displayed, the first line appeared clearly in the report: autosomal profile from the soda can Werner DNA sample from Claire's car. 100% match. One investigator said that at that moment, the room went silent, as if everyone had just heard the iron door of 36 years slam shut. Every suspicion, every theory, every faint lead, now converged on a single point. The person who left DNA in Claire's car on the night she disappeared was Thomas Langford. Not his broader family line, not a possible YSTR coincidence, not behavioral inference, but him. An even more shocking discovery, the second DNA trace. When the autosomal sample was deconvoluted, an analyst noticed something strange. In addition to the primary genome matching Thomas 100%, there was an extremely weak secondary DNA profile, possibly mixed DNA or secondary DNA transferred onto the evidence. Normally, a profile that faint is not strong enough to serve as courtroom evidence, but by protocol, they still compared it against YSTR markers to see whether it matched anyone. The result left the forensic team silent for a few seconds. The secondary DNA sample also carried YSTR markers consistent with the Langford branch, but with slight variation in the indices, suggesting that it belonged to the same family line, but was not identical to Thomas. There were three possibilities. The second DNA trace came from Mason, Thomas's younger brother. The DNA came from another male member of the Langford family. The DNA was a form of shadow transfer, indirect residue from an environment Thomas had previously been in contact with, but what truly chilled investigators was the potential meaning of this secondary profile. Thomas might have been involved in more than one incident, or more frighteningly, he might not have acted alone. One analyst stated plainly in an internal report, the secondary DNA trace is not strong enough to indict anyone else, but it is strong enough to suggest that the behavior associated with Claire may be repeated or patterned. For the first time in 3 decades, the case was not only identifying a perpetrator, it was hinting that there might be a series of related behaviors no one had ever seen. The decision to move to the next step, as soon as the DNA results were verified 3 times, the file was handed to the state prosecutor. A 47-page report was attached, detailing autosomal DNA direct match to Thomas Langford. YSTR deep alignment with Thomas's branch. Seat fabric fragment matches the pickup Thomas once owned. Jane Doe mtDNA matches the Whitmore maternal line. Root reconstruction diagram, logical and internally consistent. Secondary DNA trace suggests a behavioral pattern, requires further review. The prosecutor said only one sentence, "We have enough to seek an arrest warrant." One door closed, and another door opened. The DNA trap did more than identify the perpetrator. It opened a new chain of questions. What is the secondary DNA? Where did it come from? Was Claire the only victim, and did Thomas act alone, or had Mason, or someone else in the Langford family, ever been involved? But all of those questions would only be answered once Thomas faced interrogation, and that was the next step, where a 36-year secret was about to face the light. Once the arrest warrant was signed, the investigative team knew they could not approach Thomas Langford in a routine way. Thomas had been a mechanic, familiar with heavy tools, and could react dangerously if cornered. More importantly, he lived alone in a garage behind his house, a cramped space filled with the smell of oil and metal, where any tool could become a weapon. Therefore, the Kentucky State Police requested support from the regional SWAT team, including a small unit specialized in apprehending suspects in semi-industrial environments. The chosen time was 4:42 a.m., when Thomas had a habit of switching on the garage light to make coffee before starting his workday. The light from the garage would give the entry team a precise fix on his location. In the first mist of morning, 5 unmarked vehicles quietly moved onto the dirt road leading to the Langford property. The headlights were off. No one in the sparsely populated rural area noticed anything. A supervising officer pointed toward the garage. When the light comes on, we move. 4:41 a.m., still dark. 4:42 a.m., click. The yellow light inside the garage flicked on through the door's gaps. The SWAT team moved instantly. Police, search warrant. Hands where we can see them. The garage door was breached with a ram. The smell of oil, metal, and the residual heat of a welding tool poured out. Thomas was standing next to the workbench, not yet turned around. He raised his hands by reflex, eyes wide, but showing no resistance. It was as though he knew this day would come, but hadn't expected it now. He was in handcuffs within 7 seconds. While 2 officers guarded the suspect, the rest began searching the garage. An 18-item checklist from the search warrant lay across the makeshift command table. They knew exactly what they were looking for: items potentially related to transporting Claire, maps, bindings, DNA-bearing evidence, and any documents showing Thomas had traveled to Tennessee. Thomas's garage was cluttered yet internally organized. Every tool in its place, each rag folded beside a metal box. That level of order made some unusual items stand out even more. A 1980 forest map, with a mysterious red mark, in a loosely locked old wooden cabinet. Investigators found a Tennessee topographic map printed in 1980. This kind of map had long since become obsolete, its edges frayed and worn. On the map, only 2 places were marked in red ink: a stretch of road leading into the Royal Blue Wildlife Management Area, and a specific forest sector very close to where Jane Doe's body was found in 1988. When the investigator brought the map into the light, no one spoke for a few seconds. One officer finally said, "He didn't just know the woods, he had gone exactly there." This was not a map owned by chance, it was a map that had been used. A coil of rope, similar to the type found near Jane Doe's body. In a corner of the garage, next to a toolbox of bolts and old locks, there was a beige coil of rope, a synthetic type used in construction and cargo binding, with a smaller diameter than what is usually sold in stores. What unnerved investigators was that the rope had been cut into segments, the ends were slightly ground down, and the material matched the type recorded in Tennessee's 1988 forensic report. The rope found near Jane Doe's body, that could not be matched to any source at the time. Preliminary checks by the forensics team showed the same material, polypropylene blended with nylon, a rope type uncommon in everyday use, but often used by mechanics or lumber workers to tie materials. One officer immediately made the connection: Thomas had once driven loads of lumber to Tennessee. This type of rope aligned with that work. Although they could not conclude on the spot that the rope in the garage was the exact coil from the Tennessee scene, the similarity further reinforced the emerging structure of the case. Other items that reinforced the picture: during the search, they also seized an old knife blade with dark rust-like stains sealed for testing, maintenance records for Thomas's 1978 pickup, before he sold it, a fuel receipt from a gas station near I-75 in 1987, in the month Claire disappeared, and a notebook with several pages torn out, where the remaining dates aligned with the period of Claire's disappearance. No single item was enough to convict on its own, but together they formed a deeply troubling picture. How did Thomas react? As he was led out of the garage, Thomas did not shout or ask why he was being arrested. He only lowered his head, his hands trembling slightly behind the cuffs. The supervising officer later recalled, "There was a moment when I thought he was going to say something, but then he bit his lip and stayed quiet." That silence was not the silence of an innocent man. It was the silence of someone who knew he had finally been overtaken by science and time. The map and the rope, 2 pieces that closed the investigative loop back in the temporary command post. As the evidence was laid out, the lead investigator said, "It took us 3 decades to understand Claire's journey. But it took just one morning in this garage to see that Thomas had carried the secret with him all along." The map pointed to the place where Claire was found. The rope matched the type from the scene. The autosomal DNA was a 100% match. The YSTR aligned with his branch. The pickup seat fabric matched the truck he once owned. There was no longer a suspect. Now Thomas Langford was the prime perpetrator. From the Jessamine County garage to the interrogation room, Thomas was placed in the car, the door closed. The red and blue lights came on, washing over the dusty garage, filled with remnants of 3 decades of quiet living, or hiding. A young officer whispered, as he watched the dirt road fade behind the car window, "Everything started here, but it's also going to end here." The Claire Whitmore case, now the Claire Langford homicide case, was about to enter its most crucial phase, interrogation, where the truth could no longer hide in the shadows of a garage. Interrogation Room 3 at the Kentucky State Police Station was cramped, neon white lights spilling down onto a cold metal table. Thomas Langford sat across from 2 veteran investigators, Captain Mullen and FBI Special Agent Shepard, who had worked multiple major genealogy-based cases before. Thomas folded his arms, his thumbs rubbing against his palms like a deeply ingrained habit. He did not ask for a lawyer right away. He did not resist. He just stayed silent, his face somewhere between cautious and tired. Shepard opened with a slow, even voice, "No threats, no pressure. Thomas, we want to hear your version of the night of August 14, 1987. Thomas answered immediately, as if the response had been rehearsed in his mind for years. I was at home, alone. I've said that already. Mullen took notes, then looked up and asked, do you know why we have to verify that alibi so carefully? Thomas shrugged, a bit stiffly. Because of that missing girl. But I had nothing to do with it. You all suspected Mason back then, and now you've turned to me. Thomas said it so naturally that an outsider might have believed he was truly innocent. But to the investigators, it was the first signal. Thomas was trying to steer the conversation toward Mason. No one accused him directly. Shepard simply opened a folder, took out a photo of Thomas's 1978 pickup, the one he'd sold in 1990, and placed it on the table. You remember this truck, right? Thomas pressed his fingers together, nodding slightly. That's my truck. But it's long gone. Shepard laid down a second photo, showing the seat fabric fragment found in Claire's car. This is the seat fabric from your pickup, isn't it? Thomas raised his eyebrows. I don't know where that came from. Shepard tilted his head. We do, and you do too. It tore in 1986, and you patched it with this material. The insurance company documented it. For the first time, Thomas didn't answer right away. The first gap, the pickup. Mullen spoke slowly. Both you and your brother had brown pickups, but only you had this seat, and that fabric was found in Claire's car. Thomas replied in a low voice, maybe she met someone else with the same kind of seat. Mullen looked him straight in the eye. That kind is very rare. Only a few garages in Jessamine used it, and you're the only one in our records who ever replaced a seat with that material. Thomas pressed his lips together but still denied. I don't know who Claire is. I'm not involved. The second gap, DNA. Shepard opened the autosomal DNA report, and slid the sheet toward Thomas. Do you want to explain why your DNA is in Claire's car? Thomas stayed silent. His eyes dropped to the table. His hands tensed. You could say you once fixed someone's car, gave someone a ride, sat in someone else's car. Shepard continued, but that DNA is in the position where someone would be if they were restraining or pulling the victim out of the seat. Thomas closed his eyes for a few seconds, then opened them. You can find somebody's DNA anywhere if you look. Old cars. Lots of people ride in them. Mullen answered quietly, not in that spot, Thomas. That spot only gets DNA when someone leans across the seat to struggle with or hold down the victim. Thomas's voice hardened. It wasn't me. The third gap. The Tennessee map. The investigator placed the 1980 forest map on the table. The same map with the red marks near Jane Doe's location. How do you explain this map? Thomas glanced at it, then answered with forced nonchalance. I used it back when I was doing delivery runs. Lots of guys in the trade had maps like that. Mullen pointed at the two red ink marks, but no one else marked exactly the two locations where Claire's body was found nearby. Thomas shook his head. I didn't mark it. Who knows how long that map's been around? A deliberately evasive answer. The fourth gap, the rope. Shepard placed the coil of rope from the garage on the table. This material is a 100% match to the rope found beside Claire's body. How do you explain that? Thomas exhaled sharply, with a hint of anger. Everyone's got rope like that. Any mechanic uses it. Shepard's voice stayed steady. This type is not generic rope. It's only sold in 3 stores. One of them is 1.2 miles from your garage. Thomas fell silent. The fifth gap, the journey. The investigator spread out the route map from Lexington to Royal Blue WMA. You drove timber loads on this exact route for years. You know those woods, don't you? Thomas answered, looking straight ahead. Yeah, but that doesn't mean I did anything. Mullen paused for a beat, then said the line the team had prepared for weeks. Thomas, every lead route, truck, seat, rope, map, DNA points to you. But we want to know why. Thomas shot back immediately. It wasn't me. When the contradiction exposes itself, Shepard opened a page from an old case file and laid it on the table. The problem is here, Thomas. You've been lying since 1987. Thomas frowned. What did I lie about? Mullen laced his fingers. Calm. You said that night you were home. Alone. Never went out. Never made a call. Never saw anyone. Thomas nodded. That's right. Mullen slid a pale yellow printout toward him. The 1987 phone log. Thomas glanced at it, and froze. Shepard read each word slowly. 11:14 n.m. in 1:10 p.m., August 14, 1987. The Langford home number dialed the Whitmore residence. The room went silent. For a long time, Thomas swallowed hard. His eyes started to waver, as if the ground beneath him had just given way. Mullen spoke softly but sharply. "How do you explain that?" Thomas stammered. I don't remember. I don't know. Maybe Mason called." Shepard laid another page on the table. "The home phone you had didn't have speed dial. To call someone you had to dial each number by hand, near midnight, in a rural area, to the home of a girl who vanished that same night." Thomas gripped the table edge, his fingernails trembling. "Thomas," Shepard went on, "you say you didn't know Claire, but someone in your house called her home at exactly the time she was being taken out of Lexington." Thomas shook his head hard. "I don't know. I don't remember. Maybe I misdialed." Mullen looked deep into his eyes. "No one misdials a 7-digit number, and you yourself said you were the only one home that night." The gap had become too heavy for Thomas to fill with words. The crack in the wall of silence. Shepard spoke, his tone lower, more human. "Thomas, it's been 36 years. We're not here to find someone who has to die in prison. We're here to find the truth. You say you didn't do it, but everything says the opposite." Thomas buried his face in his hands. For the first time, he could no longer maintain his rigid composure. Mullen gently slid the forest map back toward him. "You were there. That night, we know." Thomas didn't say no anymore. He just breathed hard, irregularly, then spoke in a hoarse voice that almost fell out of his mouth. I didn't." Shepard seized on that moment. "You didn't mean what, Thomas? You didn't mean to do what?" Thomas went silent again, as if he had just said something he shouldn't have. But the truth still would not fully step out. Even shaken, Thomas did not confess. He asked for a lawyer. The interrogation had to pause, but the investigators left the room with something clearer than ever. Thomas stumbled when confronted with the DNA. He couldn't explain the pickup seat fabric. He couldn't explain the map. He couldn't explain the rope, and most of all he couldn't explain the phone call on the night of August 14, 1987. That call was the event that started everything. A sign no one recognized over 3 decades ago. A puzzle piece that took nearly 40 years of technology to pull out of the dark. There was no confession, but every piece of evidence spoke for him. When the interrogation ended without a confession from Thomas, the investigators knew the next step had to be done carefully and strategically, to present the entire case before the Fayette County grand jury, which would decide whether there was enough basis to indict Thomas Langford for murder. The grand jury room did not look like a public courtroom. There was no defense lawyer arguing for the suspect, no audience, no cameras, only the prosecutor, a special 12-person jury, and a mountain of files gathered from 3 decades of scattered investigation. Before stepping into that room, lead prosecutor Deborah Ayers sent out a report listing the evidence count, 123 items: physical, forensic, documentary, maps, photos, witness statements, and digital data, all compiled into a file over 700 pages thick. Ayers looked at the stack of documents and quietly told the investigative team, "We're not just presenting evidence, we're telling a story that science has already confirmed." 123 pieces of evidence, and how they were arranged into a chain. The prosecutor presented them in 3 layers. First layer, timeline: Claire left work at 9:10 p.m. Her car was abandoned on Old Frankfort Pike. The route leading out to I-75 was reconstructed using modern GPS. The travel time matched the body being found in Tennessee. Second layer, physical evidence. The pickup seat fabric fragment matched the truck Thomas once owned. The rope fiber was the same type as the rope found near Claire's body. A 1980 forest map had markings near the Royal Blue WMA area. A 1987 gas receipt on the I-75 route. Third layer, DNA. M18 DNA matched the Whitmore maternal line, confirming Jane Doe = Claire. YSTR matched the Langford family line, strongly leaning toward Thomas. Autosomal DNA from the soda can. Thomas discarded 100% match with the DNA in Claire's car. An extremely faint secondary DNA sample also carried Langford markers, suggesting repeated behavior. On the grand jury table, each piece of evidence was laid out like a brick, and when stacked in the right order, the road leading to Thomas became unmistakably clear. Key explanations before the grand jury heirs did not present the case as a one-sided accusation. She rebuilt it by letting the evidence speak for itself, while she only helped connect the dots. She stood before the jurors and asked, "Whose DNA do we have in Claire's car?" A technician answered, "Thomas Langford." "No doubt. What kind of seat fabric do we have in the cabin?" "The kind that was only ever replaced in Thomas's pickup in 1986. "What map leads to where Claire was found?" "A map belonging to Thomas, with 2 marked points that match the body recovery area." In this way, the grand jury moved from one piece of evidence to the next. No gaps, no room for a second theory to slip in. The piece of evidence forgotten for 30 years, the anonymous letter. When heirs announced there was one final piece of evidence yet to be presented, the Kentucky investigators immediately knew what she was about to bring out. An old file packet was opened, the paper yellowed, edges beginning to fray. It was an anonymous letter, sent to the police department in 1988, just a few months after Claire disappeared. The letter was written in thick ballpoint pen, the sentences tangled, the handwriting shaky, but one passage made the entire grand jury room go silent. "There is a man in Jessamine County who often follows women coming home from work at night. He drives a brown pickup. People call him Tommy Lang." The name trailed off, but no one needed to read further. In 1988, the letter had been treated as unverified information, placed in a secondary file drawer, and gradually forgotten, as earlier investigators retired or transferred. In 2019, when the files were digitized, a records clerk noticed an envelope that had not been properly coded. The letter was brought back into the light, after 30 years stuck in an administrative mistake. Now, it became a piece with historical weight. Someone had once warned about Thomas Langford's habit of following women. It described a brown pickup. It linked his behavior to women coming off late shifts, the exact pattern Claire followed. When heirs placed the letter before the grand jury, no one misunderstood its meaning. Thomas did not just coincidentally fit, he had been seen, recognized, and feared by some in the community. Since 1988, the behavioral expert's assessment, an FBI behavioral expert, who had analyzed dozens of opportunistic offender profiles, was called to testify before the grand jury. Offenders who operate using roadside abduction patterns usually start by following women. They choose repeatable routes, and they choose consistent times. He pointed to the map of Claire's usual route. "Here, the pattern matches perfectly." The grand jury reaches a conclusion. The hearing lasted 2 days. 123 pieces of evidence were reviewed. The anonymous letter was read aloud 3 times. The autosomal DNA was analyzed in detail 1 more time. When the grand jury went into deliberation, none of the investigators said a word. They had walked this road too long to risk hoping too early. But after just 54 minutes, the door opened. The foreperson stood up and placed the decision on the table. The grand jury finds there is sufficient evidence to indict Thomas Langford for murder in the first degree in connection with the death of Claire Whitmore. 36 years after Claire vanished, justice finally found a direction, but the case was still not over, because in court, Thomas still had one last chance to try to change the story. The Fayette County courtroom was more crowded than on any day in the past 3 decades, not because this was a widely publicized trial, but because locals had lived long enough to remember Claire Whitmore's disappearance when it was still Lexington's haunting story, and now they wanted to see the ending. Defendant Thomas Langford, 60, was brought into the courtroom. He wore a gray shirt, his face more gaunt than when he was arrested. Next to him was his court-appointed defense attorney, experienced, but without the resources to counter a prosecution team backed by federal DNA experts and Othram. Prosecutor Deborah Ayers stood before the jury, her voice clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we are not just judging a crime from 1987, we are judging a truth that science, time, and the persistence of those who never gave up have woven back together." There was no long dramatic opening. Ayres moved directly to what would become the centerpiece of the trial: forensic 3D reconstruction, a full scientific simulation of Claire's final journey. Forensic 3D reconstruction: science retells the night Claire disappeared. The lights dimmed halfway. The large screen behind the prosecution flickered on. 3D rendered images appeared. The Lexington Clinic parking lot, as Claire left her shift, her small sedan, moving along Old Frankfort Pike, the dark stretch where her car was found, and the point where the suspect's pickup approached from behind. The reconstruction expert narrated, "We built this simulation using historic GPS data, 1987 satellite imagery, nighttime light analysis, and the vantage point of the witness. This is how we reconstructed the most likely sequence of events." On screen, the jury saw the pickup pulling up close behind Claire's car, the exact spot where the pickup seat fabric fell into the cabin, and a force model showing a brief struggle occurring right at the back seat. The expert explained, "Thomas's DNA appears exactly at the location where someone would be if they were pulling the victim down into the seat. With that amount of force, seat fabric from the pickup could easily fall into the place where we found it." The jury was completely silent. A cold reconstruction was saying what no one had witnessed that night. Next, the 3D reconstruction shifted to the travel route. The road from Lexington to Royal Blue WMA lit up in red, matching time, matching speed, matching the soil sample found under Claire's car, matching the map location marked in red in Thomas's cabinet. At the end of the route, the simulation shifted to Royal Blue's forested terrain, where Claire's body was found in 1988. Ayres pointed at the screen, "We have physical data, environmental data, and DNA data. All of it leads to one road, the road Thomas took." The prosecution presents the evidence, layered, precise and cold. Ayres began presenting the evidence in chronological order, not to dramatize, but to let the truth reveal itself. Physical evidence: the pickup seat fabric fragment, matching the truck Thomas once owned. The coil of rope with the same composition as the rope found in Tennessee. The 1980 forest map with 2 red ink marks, matching the body recovery area. DNA evidence: autosomal DNA from Thomas's discarded soda can 100% match with DNA in Claire's car. YSTR, pointing to the Langford line, with high probability it belonged to Thomas. MET-T DNA establishing that Jane Doe was indeed Claire Whitmore. Behavioral evidence: Thomas had no alibi the night Claire disappeared. The strange call from the Langford home to the Whitmore home, at 11:14 p. in 1987. Thomas's statements conflicted with phone records, work schedules, and gas receipts. The jurors took notes non-stop. Each piece of evidence was another brick added to the wall closing in around Thomas. The defense pushes back, but weakly and in fragments. Thomas's attorney stood to object. "No one directly witnessed Thomas doing anything. There's no camera, no weapon, and only indirect DNA." But Ayres countered immediately with scientific data. A 100% autosomal DNA match cannot be indirect. The seat fabric fragment could not randomly end up in Claire's car. The Tennessee map with red markings could not coincidentally point exactly to the body location. The attorney tried another angle. Claire's car could have been touched by someone else, not Thomas. Ayres calmly replied, "True, but that person would have to share Thomas Langford's exact autosomal DNA profile, which is practically impossible." The jurors looked at one another. They understood this was not a case built on mere theory, it was built on matter, science, time, and history. The defense attorney's arguments weakened with each response. He tried to create reasonable doubt but had no ammunition left. A new witness, appearing when no one expected it midway through the trial. The prosecution announced an additional witness, not a direct eyewitness to the crime, but someone who had once lived near Old Frankfort Pike in 1987. Her name was Marjorie Hale, 76, called to the stand. She had lived in a small wooden house about half a mile from where Claire's car was found. In 1987, she had reported hearing a scream, but remembered little else. However, when she saw a photo of Thomas's pickup before the trial, she called the police. She spoke slowly, her voice trembling. "I remember that truck, not because of the color, Because of the dent on the left side. A big dent, Ayers asked. Are you sure, Miss Hale? Where did you see that pickup? She answered, right near where they found that girl's car. That night, I saw it going very slow, lights off, then backing up to the side of the road. I didn't see anything after that. Until I heard the scream. The defense objected. A 36-year-old memory isn't reliable. But Ayers was ready. The 1985 repair record for Thomas's pickup documented a large dent on the left side. The witness described the size and position correctly. No one else in Jessamine County owned a truck with that exact feature. The jurors bent over their notepads again. The elderly witness's words were like a long thread stretching across 3 decades, binding a hazy past to a present filled with science. Thomas watches himself being exposed. Throughout the entire presentation of the new witness, Thomas kept his eyes on the table, his fingers trembling slightly, as he tried to stay calm. At the moment, Mrs. Hale said, I heard a scream right after that pickup stopped. Thomas looked toward his lawyer, as if waiting for an explanation. There was none. At the moment the prosecution presented the repair record with the dent, Thomas closed his eyes. At the moment the autosomal DNA was projected on the screen, Thomas put his hand to his forehead. Finally, when Ayers concluded her presentation, not a single piece of evidence stands alone, but when put together, they are no longer suspicion, they are the truth. Thomas lifted his head, his eyes red, and fixed on an invisible point in the air. The end of arguments. A truth has taken shape. When the trial day 3 ended, the jury entered deliberation carrying with them the 3D forensic reconstruction, the complete autosomal DNA, the Langford branch YSTR, the matching pickup seat fabric from Thomas's truck, the rope of the same material, the 1980 forest map with red marks, the new witness's testimony, the strange 1987 phone call, and Thomas's conflicting statements. Nothing left any gaps. One investigator looked at the courtroom emptying out and said, "This is not just justice for Claire, this is justice for 36 years of silence." The jury would give an answer, but everyone in the room knew that answer had already been written into every strand of DNA, every trace of soil, every piece of fabric, and into the final drive of Claire Whitmore. On sentencing morning, the hallway of Fayette County Court was more crowded than on any previous day. No one shoved, no one spoke loudly. The people of Kentucky had carried the story of Claire Whitmore with them for 36 years, and today they wanted to see the final period. Thomas Langford was brought into the courtroom with his hands trembling slightly. He was no longer wearing the gray shirt from the earlier days, but a light blue prison uniform. That face, which had remained calm for decades, could no longer hold its blankness. His eyes were sunken, his back slightly hunched as if the weight of 36 years had finally settled on him. The jury returned after hours of deliberation. The foreperson read the verdict, voice clear and without the slightest hesitation. "We find the defendant, Thomas Langford, guilty of murder in the first degree." No one clapped. There were no cheers, only the sound of sighs, a sad kind of release. Judge Richards looked directly at Thomas. "Mr. Langford, scientific evidence, witness testimony, and integrated data have confirmed your responsibility in causing the death of Claire Whitmore in 1987. The court sentences you to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole." The sentence fell over the room, like the final note of a symphony that had played on for 3 decades. Thomas did not resist. He only nodded slightly, a movement so small that anyone standing a few yards away might not have noticed. 2 officers led him out of the courtroom. At the moment the door opened, Thomas looked back once, not with pleading or rage, but like a man who had finally understood that every escape route had been blocked off by the very history he tried to bury. The power of genealogical DNA, the victory of science. After the trial, prosecutor Deborah Ayers spoke to the press. She did not talk about victory, but about technology. Genealogical DNA does not create justice, it only opens the door that leads us to the truth. In the press room, a large screen showed the Langford family tree chart, a circle marking Thomas, the path from YSTR to autosomal DNA, from the secondary trace to the full match. Ayers explained, traditionally, DNA only hit when the offender already had a profile in CODIS. Modern genealogical DNA allows us to trace back from distant relatives, from people who have never committed a crime. Forensic sequencing can analyze extremely small or even mixed samples. Without this technology, Thomas likely would have lived out his life with no one ever knowing what he had done on a summer night in 1987. A veteran detective standing next to Ayers added, "We did not solve this case by luck. We solved it with persistence and evidence, including evidence that, 30 years ago, we didn't yet know how to read." That power, the ability to force time to speak what it has hidden, left many in the briefing room deep in thought. Shockwaves in the community. Lexington exhales, then goes quiet. Not celebration, not partying. The Lexington community responded with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Claire's mother, now over 70 years old, gave a brief statement to the media. "We are not happy. We just know that my daughter is finally being called by her right name." Locals came to lay flowers where Claire's car had been found. A blue ribbon was tied around an old marker on Old Frankfort Pike, a symbol for unsolved missing person cases. And at the university where Claire once studied, a criminology class added this case to a lecture titled, "When Science Finally Catches Up to the Past." The final twist, from a forgotten notebook a week after Thomas was moved to Green River Correctional Complex, the investigative team returned to his home to finish sealing secondary evidence. In the garage, amid old paperwork, they found a small brown leather notebook, dusty and buried deep in an unlocked drawer. At first, everyone assumed it was just a repair log, but when they turned to the third page, something made the entire team hold their breath. A strange symbol, 3 diagonal lines and a circle. It looked identical to the red mark Thomas had drawn on the Tennessee map. The next page had a date, July 1985, 2 years before Claire disappeared, and a single short scrawled line, KM, Route 32, last seen. Nothing more, no details, no full name, no specific location, just 3 marks and 1 vague note. A young investigator asked, "What is KM? A person, a place, something from work?" The lead investigator looked closely, then stayed quiet for a long moment. "Route 32, 1985. We have a missing person on that stretch, that exact year. That case, a 24-year-old woman, who disappeared while driving along Route 32, had never been solved. No body, no suspect, no clue. And now, the notation in Thomas's notebook matched the time frame and route of that disappearance. The notebook was immediately sealed as new evidence. In the report to the prosecutor, the short conclusion line gave everyone goosebumps. It is possible that the Claire Whitmore case was not the only one. Ending. Or just the beginning of a new chapter. In the courthouse hallway on sentencing day, a journalist asked Ayers, "Is this case over?" She only replied, "Claire's case is over, but the historical file of Thomas Langford is not, because science does not stop at a life sentence. It will keep opening every locked drawer of the past." And now, Thomas's old notebook, with 3 marks and the letters KM, has just become the first doorway to a new investigation. The Claire Whitmore case is closed, but the final bigger question has just opened. How many other secrets of Thomas Langford remain undiscovered? And so the story ends, but its aftershocks begin to spread into years that have not yet been answered. The story of Claire Whitmore is not just a cold case solved after 36 years, it is a mirror reflecting many truths about American society today. In a vast country where driving is part of daily life, a young woman heading home along Old Frankfort Pike, and then vanishing along the way hits directly at a very real fear, shared by millions of American women, the fragility of personal safety. Claire being forced to stop on a dark, isolated stretch of road reminds us of the value of safety rules that may seem old-fashioned, but have never stopped being necessary. Not traveling alone on desolate routes, sharing live location with loved ones, treating alertness as a life skill rather than a sign of overreacting. Another thought-provoking detail is how Claire's family never gave up, even when the file was frozen for decades. They preserved her medical records with the broken nose, cooperated with investigators, and willingly provided DNA samples from her mother and sister. In the context of today's America, where news cycles spin fast, their story reminds us that justice does not always arrive on time, but the persistence of victims and families creates a moral pressure that forces the system to keep revisiting the past. Genealogical DNA technology, Othram, YSTER, mtDNA, family trees. These may sound dryly scientific, but they reveal another big lesson. Scientific progress is not just there to look cool. It exists to correct the mistakes and gaps of the past. The night Claire was robbed of her voice, but 30 years later, her bones, soil, fibers and DNA spoke on her behalf. In a society that sometimes doubts institutions, this story offers a balancing reminder. The system can be slow, can be wrong, but when the community, the family, science, and investigators who don't give up all stand on the same side, justice still has a chance to be seen, late, but not completely lost. If you believe stories like The Long Road to Justice for Claire Whitmore need to keep being told, please hit subscribe to stay with us. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we continue to unlock the secrets time tried to bury.